May 14, 1852. Augustus Whitfield had kept the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company ledgers for 11 years without a single ink blot marring the columns, but on the morning the note came due, his hand trembled as he entered the final sum. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The figure stared back at him from the vellum page. $4,327 owed to Hiram Caldwell of Savannah by close of business on the 15th day of May. The number had been growing in his peripheral vision for 18 months, swelling with each quarterly interest calculation, but seeing it totaled in his own meticulous script made the weight of it settle differently in his chest. He closed the private ledger, the one he kept separate from the bank's official books, and returned it to the false bottom of his desk drawer, beneath the stack of blank promissory notes and the seal he no longer had legal authority to use. The morning light through the bank's tall windows had a quality of reproach to it, illuminating the dust motes that hung suspended above the polished pine floor. Outside, the bells of St. Paul's Episcopal Church marked the hour of 8, and the sound carried across Broad Street with a clarity that suggested fair weather. Augustus counted the chimes by habit, his fingers resting on the closed drawer. The bank would open in 1 hour. Preston Montgomery, the head cashier, would arrive first, followed by the 2 junior clerks who handled the routine discounting of merchants' notes. They would see nothing amiss in Augustus's manner. He had cultivated over many years an expression of mild attention that betrayed neither approval nor concern, and this expression had served him well through the panic of 1837 and the cotton price collapse of 1840. It would serve him now. He rose from his desk and moved to the tall cabinet where the bank's collateral documents were filed. Each mortgage, each deed of trust, each bill of sale was stored in its designated compartment, organized by date of maturity. His hands moved through the folders with practiced efficiency, though what he sought was not among the bank's legitimate holdings. What he sought existed only in his private records, a series of transactions he had conducted in his own name, using his position at the bank to facilitate loans he had no capital to secure. The scheme had seemed sound at the time. Cotton prices were rising, and the railroad extension from Augusta to Atlanta promised to double land values within 3 years. Augustus had borrowed against that promise, taking notes from Caldwell and 2 other Savannah speculators, using the funds to purchase acreage along the proposed rail line. The land would be worth $8,000 by now, perhaps $10,000 if the railroad had maintained its construction schedule. But the railroad had stalled 20 miles outside of Augusta, mired in disputes over right-of-way, and the discovery that the surveyed route crossed a greater expanse of swampland than the original maps had indicated. The land Augustus had purchased with borrowed money now sat worthless, and the notes he had signed came due in sequence, each one a guillotine blade suspended over his position, his reputation, and his future. He returned to his desk and withdrew from his coat pocket a letter that had arrived the previous evening. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, embossed with Caldwell's mark. Augustus had not needed to open it to know its contents, but he had opened it nevertheless, reading by candlelight in his study while the household slept. The language was cordial but unambiguous. Mr. Caldwell reminded Augustus of their agreement, specified the sum owed and the date of maturity, and expressed confidence that a man of Augustus's standing would honor his obligations. The final paragraph contained the letter's true message. Caldwell would be in Augusta on the 16th to attend to certain business matters and hoped to call upon Augustus at his earliest convenience to settle their account. There was no money. Augustus had already liquidated what he could without attracting notice. A parcel of timberland inherited from his father, sold quietly to a buyer in South Carolina. His wife's pearl brooch and garnet ring, pawned in Savannah under an assumed name. Even the silver flatware that had been in the Whitfield family for 2 generations, replaced with plated copies that his wife, Constance, had not yet noticed were different in weight and luster. These measures had raised perhaps $900, enough to satisfy the 2 smaller notes that had matured in March, but nowhere near sufficient for Caldwell's claim. Augustus had explored every conventional avenue. He could not approach the bank for a loan. His own financial entanglement would be discovered immediately, and his position terminated. He could not sell the land. There were no buyers at any price. He could not appeal to family. His own kin in Virginia had severed relations after his father's estate was divided, and Constance's people in Charleston had made clear in their wedding correspondence that no further financial assistance would be forthcoming. What remained was a single, previously unthinkable option that had taken shape in his mind over the past 6 weeks, with the slow inevitability of a stain spreading through fabric. Augustus withdrew from his desk drawer a sheaf of papers, legal documents of a type the bank handled routinely in its capacity as agent for estate settlements and property transfers. Among these documents were blank indenture forms, printed in Savannah, used to formalize labor contracts and apprenticeships. The forms were standard instruments, their language tested by decades of common law and modified to comply with Georgia's particular statutes regarding the conveyance of service obligations. He had studied the forms extensively, noting the provisions that allowed for the indenture of family members to satisfy debt, the clauses that specified term of service and conditions of labor, and, most critically, the section that permitted the indentured party to be sold or transferred at the creditor's discretion, effectively converting the obligation into a form of property that could be liquidated to recover the debt. The law was clear, if rarely invoked in cases involving white women of good family. An indenture, properly executed and witnessed, constituted a binding contract that superseded the ordinary protections of coverture and dependency. The indentured party became, for the duration of the term, a chattel interest subject to the same rules of ownership and transfer that governed enslaved labor. Augustus had verified this understanding through careful research in the county courthouse records, where he discovered 3 cases from the previous decade in which daughters of insolvent debtors had been indentured to satisfy their father's obligations. In each case, the term of service was substantial, 10 years, 15 years, and in 2 cases the indentured women had been sold to parties in other states. The records provided no information about their subsequent fates. He set the indenture form on his desk and stared at it for a long moment. The printed text swam slightly in his vision, and he realized he had not eaten since the previous noon. The nausea that had plagued him for weeks intensified, but he forced himself to breathe slowly until the sensation passed. The church bells marked the half-hour. Preston Montgomery would arrive soon, and the bank's daily business would commence. Augustus returned the papers to his drawer and locked it, pocketing the key. He put on his coat, checked his appearance in the small mirror mounted beside the door, and descended the stairs to unlock the bank's main entrance. The air outside carried the smell of the Savannah River, a humid vegetable scent mixed with coal smoke from the steamboats docked at the levee. Wagons were already moving along Broad Street, hauling cotton bales to the warehouses or delivering goods to the merchants who lined the commercial blocks. Augusta was prosperous, swollen with the wealth of the interior cotton trade, and the visible signs of that prosperity. The new brick facades, the iron balconies, the steady traffic of commercial vehicles seemed to mock Augustus's private catastrophe. He stood in the doorway of the bank watching the city wake and thought about his daughter. Caroline was 16, born in the 3rd year of his marriage to Constance, the only child to survive past infancy from 4 pregnancies. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she possessed a quality of seriousness that Augustus had always attributed to her extensive reading. Constance had insisted on educating Caroline beyond what was strictly conventional, engaging a series of tutors to instruct her in literature, history, and even basic mathematics. The result was a young woman who could discuss Walter Scott with facility and who kept detailed household accounts with a precision that would have served her well in a counting house, had such a position been open to her sex. Caroline's future had been planned since her 13th birthday. She would marry well, not extravagantly but comfortably, to a professional man of good family and moderate property. 2 suitable prospects had already emerged, the younger son of a Savannah attorney and a physician newly established in Augusta with excellent connections in Charleston. Constance had managed these prospects with the careful attention she applied to all domestic matters, arranging meetings at church socials, and ensuring Caroline appeared to advantage in settings where her accomplishments could be observed without ostentation. That future, marriage, household, the security of coverture and social position, would be foreclosed entirely if Augustus defaulted on Caldwell's note, and the full extent of his debts became public knowledge. No man of standing would ally himself with a family tainted by insolvency and disgrace. Caroline would be unmarriageable, dependent on relatives who had already demonstrated their unwillingness to provide assistance, facing a future of genteel poverty at best and destitution at worst. The indenture would prevent that outcome. Caroline would serve her term, 10 years or perhaps less, if she were purchased by a household that valued her education and refinement. The debt would be satisfied, Augustus's position preserved, and when Caroline's term expired, she would be free to resume a life that might still include marriage and respectability. The alternative was ruin for all of them. Augustus had rehearsed these justifications until they acquired the smooth texture of truth, but standing in the doorway of the bank, watching the morning traffic pass, he felt the full weight of what he was contemplating, and the nausea returned with force. Preston Montgomery appeared at the far end of the block, walking briskly with the leather satchel he carried to and from the bank each day. Augustus straightened, assumed his customary expression of mild attention, and prepared to begin the day's business. The bank's routine unfolded as it always did. Notes were discounted, deposits recorded, withdrawals processed, and correspondence drafted for the afternoon post. Augustus moved through his duties with mechanical precision, his mind occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with the transactions passing across his desk. The indenture would require 2 witnesses and registration with the county clerk. Augustus had already identified the witnesses: Thomas Brennan, a clerk at the courthouse who owed Augustus a favor from a discreetly forgotten irregularity in a property transfer 3 years prior, and Dr. Samuel Garrett, the bank's physician, who could be persuaded to sign on the pretext that Caroline required medical evaluation as part of a routine apprenticeship agreement. Neither man would question the arrangement too closely, Brennan because he could not afford to, and Garrett because his position depended on maintaining good relations with the bank's officers. The registration itself would be straightforward. Indenture contracts were filed with the same casual efficiency as deeds and mortgages, added to the public record with minimal scrutiny. By the time anyone examined the document closely enough to recognize its unusual nature, the contract would be in force and Caroline would be in Caldwell's custody, beyond reach of intervention or appeal. Augustus had chosen the timing carefully. Constance would be occupied the following afternoon with the Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting at the Methodist Church, a monthly gathering she never missed. Caroline would be at home with the housekeeper, studying the piano lesson she had been assigned by her music tutor. Augustus would return from the bank at 2 o'clock, an hour earlier than his usual schedule, and inform Caroline that her presence was required for the signing of certain documents related to a family matter. She would not resist. She had been raised to obey her father in all things, and she trusted him completely. That trust was perhaps the worst element of what Augustus was about to do, but he forced himself to view it as a necessary component of an unfortunate transaction, no different in principle from the hundreds of property conveyances he had witnessed in his years at the bank. The afternoon wore on. Augustus signed letters, reviewed loan applications, and consulted with Preston Montgomery about a delinquent account. At 4 o'clock, as the bank prepared to close, a messenger arrived with a second letter from Caldwell. This communication was briefer than the first. Caldwell confirmed his arrival in Augusta for the 16th and specified that he would call upon Augustus at the bank at 10 o'clock that morning to receive payment. The letter concluded with a single sentence that Augustus read 3 times before folding the paper and placing it in his coat pocket. "I trust you have made appropriate arrangements to satisfy our account, as I am prepared to pursue all legal remedies necessary to secure payment." The threat was explicit. Caldwell would initiate proceedings to seize Augustus's property, expose his fraudulent land speculation, and destroy his position at the bank. The process would be public, ruinous, and swift. Augustus locked the bank, walked home through the lengthening shadows, and sat in his study until the household retired for the night. At midnight, he lit a candle, withdrew the indenture form from his desk, and began filling in the required information with his smallest, neatest hand. The document took shape under his pen. Caroline Whitfield, daughter of Augustus Whitfield of Augusta, Georgia, being 16 years of age and of sound mind and body, does hereby bind herself to serve Hiram Caldwell of Savannah, Georgia, his heirs and assigns for a term of 12 years, in exchange for the satisfaction of debts owed by her father, in the amount of $4,327. He continued writing, his hand steady now, specifying the terms and conditions, the rights of transfer and sale, the acknowledgement that Caroline entered into the agreement of her own free will. Though that clause was a legal fiction, minors could be indentured by parental authority regardless of consent. When the document was complete, Augustus signed his name at the bottom and set the pen aside. He would obtain the witnesses' signatures tomorrow, file the contract with the county clerk before close of business, and present Caldwell with proof of satisfaction when he arrived on the 16th. The transaction would be legal, binding, and irreversible. Augustus extinguished the candle and sat in darkness, listening to the house settle around him, the small sounds of wood contracting and the distant chime of a clock marking the hours. Somewhere above him, Caroline slept peacefully in her room, unaware that her father had just converted her into a negotiable instrument to save himself from ruin. In 18 hours, she would cease to be his daughter and become instead a piece of property valued at $4,327, plus accrued interest. May 15, 1852. Augustus rose before dawn and dressed by candlelight, moving through the motions with the mechanical precision of a man who has rehearsed each gesture in his mind until it becomes rote. The house was silent, except for the faint sounds of Martha, the housekeeper, stirring embers in the kitchen below. Through the window, the sky held the gray-blue quality of early morning in mid-May, and the air carried the damp scent of the Savannah River mingled with the bitter tang of coal smoke from the foundries along Reynolds Street. He descended to his study and retrieved the completed indenture document from the locked drawer, examining it once more in the strengthening light. The paper was thick, official, the printed text interrupted by his careful handwritten insertions specifying Caroline's name, age, term of service, and the debt to be satisfied. 2 blank signature lines awaited the witnesses he would secure before noon. The document represented 18 months of accumulated choices, each one seemingly minor at the time, each one leading inexorably to this morning. Augustus folded the paper and placed it in his leather portfolio alongside a second document, a letter of conveyance he had drafted the previous evening, addressed to Hiram Caldwell, formally transferring all rights and interest in the indentured servant Caroline Whitfield, in exchange for the cancellation of the note due that day. Constance appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day in dark blue muslin, her hair pinned in the severe style she favored for morning household management. She inquired whether Augustus would take breakfast, and he declined, citing an early appointment at the bank. She accepted this explanation without comment, accustomed to the irregular hours that banking business sometimes required, and returned to the dining room where Caroline sat practicing her French conjugations before her morning piano lesson. Augustus left the house at 7 o'clock, walking the 6 blocks to the bank through streets already busy with draymen hauling cotton bales and merchants opening their shutters for the day's trade. The morning was warm, promising the kind of oppressive heat that would settle over Augusta by afternoon, when the humidity from the river would make even the slightest exertion uncomfortable. At the bank, he unlocked his office and immediately set about composing a note to Dr. Samuel Garrett, the physician who maintained rooms on Ellis Street and who served as medical consultant for the bank's insurance policies. The note was brief, requesting that Dr. Garrett call upon Augustus at his convenience that morning regarding a medical assessment required for a routine apprenticeship contract. Augustus sealed the note and dispatched it with one of the junior clerks, who returned 20 minutes later with Garrett's reply. The doctor would arrive at 9 o'clock. The second witness presented a more delicate matter. Thomas Brennan worked in the Richmond County Courthouse as assistant to the clerk of the Superior Court a position he had held for 7 years despite certain irregularities in his personal conduct that would have cost another man his employment. Augustus had discovered one such irregularity in 1849, when a property deed crossing his desk at the bank contained a notation in Brennan's hand that contradicted the official record filed at the courthouse. The discrepancy had allowed a speculator to claim title to a valuable lot on Broad Street, and Augustus had quietly informed Brennan of his discovery, while assuring him that the matter need not become public knowledge if Brennan proved willing to assist with certain future administrative requirements. Augustus walked to the courthouse at 8:30, carrying his portfolio under his arm. The building stood at the corner of Green and 5th Streets, a substantial brick structure with tall windows that caught the morning light. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of ink and old paper, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in rooms where documents were stored in high wooden cabinets reaching nearly to the ceiling. Brennan was at his desk in the clerk's office, bent over a ledger with a pen poised above the page. He was a thin man with graying hair and the cautious expression of someone who has learned through experience that good fortune is always temporary. When Augustus entered, Brennan looked up and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes that suggested recognition of a debt coming due. Augustus explained his need in terms that were factually accurate, but carefully incomplete. He required witness signatures on an indenture contract, a standard form, prepared on behalf of a family member entering domestic service to satisfy a private debt. Such arrangements were not uncommon, particularly among families facing financial pressure, and Brennan would understand that his role was purely administrative, to witness that the signatures were genuine and the document properly executed. Brennan agreed, as Augustus had known he would, and promised to be available at the bank at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He asked no questions about the nature of the indenture or the identity of the indentured party, and Augustus offered no additional information. The transaction took less than 5 minutes, concluded with a handshake that felt to Augustus like sealing a pact with implications neither man wished to examine too closely. Augustus returned to the bank to find Dr. Garrett waiting in the lobby. The physician was a stout man in his 50s, prosperous and conventional, whose practice catered to Augusta's merchant class and whose income depended substantially on his retainer agreements with institutions like the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company. He greeted Augustus with professional cordiality and followed him upstairs to the private office. Augustus presented the matter as Garrett would expect to hear it. A young woman from a respectable family, entering into an apprenticeship arrangement with a household in Savannah, requiring medical certification of sound health as a condition of the contract. Such assessments were routine in cases involving domestic service, particularly when the term of service was extensive and the employing party wished to ensure they were acquiring a servant capable of fulfilling her obligations. Garrett accepted the explanation without suspicion. Augustus provided no names, referring only to documentation that would require the physician's signature as witness to the medical assessment, which Augustus explained had already been conducted and found satisfactory. Garrett's role was merely to verify the administrative process, to sign the witness line confirming that proper procedures had been followed. The doctor agreed to return at 2 o'clock, the same hour Augustus had arranged with Brennan, and departed with assurances that the matter would be handled with appropriate discretion. Augustus watched him leave, noting the slight stiffness in his own shoulders, the tension that had been building since dawn and now manifested as a dull ache at the base of his skull. The morning advanced. Preston Montgomery arrived and began processing the day's transactions. The junior clerks handled routine discounting. Augustus sat at his desk, reviewing loan applications he could not concentrate on, his mind occupied with the schedule he had constructed. Constance would leave for her Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting at 1 o'clock, a gathering she attended without fail on the 3rd Thursday of every month at the Methodist Church on Green Street. The meeting typically lasted until 4, sometimes later if the society's business was particularly pressing. Caroline would be at home with Martha, the housekeeper, practicing her piano lesson. She had been assigned a new piece the previous week, a schottische by an Austrian composer whose name Augustus could not recall. and Caroline had been diligent in her practice, dedicating 3 hours each afternoon to mastering the fingering and tempo. Martha would be occupied with her own duties: the midday meal preparation, the afternoon laundry, the routine tasks that structured her days in the Whitfield household. Augustus would arrive home at 2 o'clock, earlier than his customary return, but not so unusual as to provoke comment. He would inform Caroline that her presence was required for the signing of certain family documents, routine matters that required her signature as a formality. She would comply without question, as she always did when her father made requests. She trusted him completely, had never been given reason to doubt that his decisions were made in her best interest. The witnesses would arrive shortly thereafter: Brennan from the courthouse, Dr. Garrett from his rooms on Ellis Street. The signatures would be obtained 3 minutes at most, and the document would be complete, legally binding, irrevocable. Augustus would then escort Caroline to the bank, explaining that the paperwork needed to be filed immediately to meet certain deadlines. She would accompany him without resistance, accustomed to occasional errands that took her into the commercial blocks where her father conducted his business. At the bank, Caldwell would be waiting. Augustus had sent a message the previous evening, proposing that they meet at 3 o'clock to settle the account. Caldwell's reply had been curt but affirmative. The transfer would happen in Augustus's private office, behind closed doors. Caroline would be confused, then frightened, then pleading. But by that point, the legal process would be complete. The indenture contract, signed and witnessed, would be in Caldwell's possession. The letter of conveyance would formalize the transfer of ownership. Caroline would no longer be Augustus's daughter in any sense that mattered under law. She would be Caldwell's property, subject to his authority and his decisions regarding her placement, her labor, her future. Augustus felt the nausea return, stronger now, accompanied by a sensation like cold water spreading through his chest. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on the practical necessities that remained. The document needed to be filed with the county clerk after the signing, but before close of business at 5 o'clock. Brennan would handle that task, adding the indenture to the public record where it would sit among dozens of other contracts and deeds and bills of sale, unremarkable unless someone chose to examine it closely. The church bells marked 11 o'clock. Augustus rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking down at Broad Street where wagons moved in steady procession and pedestrians navigated the wooden walkways in front of the commercial buildings. The scene was ordinary, prosperous, indifferent to the transaction that would unfold in 3 hours. At the Whitfield house on Ellis Street, Constance supervised Martha's preparation of the midday meal, while Caroline sat at the piano in the front parlor, working through the difficult passages of her assigned piece. The schottische required a particular lightness of touch, combined with precise timing, and Caroline had not yet mastered the balance. Her fingers moved across the keys with determination, repeating the same 16-bar section until the notes began to blur together. Martha moved between the kitchen and the dining room, setting out cold meats and bread and preserves, the simple fare appropriate for a Thursday luncheon when no guests were expected. She was a woman of 52, hired 7 years earlier after the previous housekeeper retired, and she performed her duties with the efficient silence of someone who understood that her position depended on remaining invisible, except when her services were specifically required. Constance checked the clock in the entrance hall, 11:30, and began preparing for her departure. The Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting would address the ongoing question of funding for the orphan asylum on Fenwick Street, a matter that had occupied the previous 3 meetings without resolution. Constance served as secretary for the society, responsible for recording minutes and maintaining correspondence, and she took the obligation seriously. She called to Caroline, informing her that luncheon would be served shortly and that Caroline should finish her practice session and wash her hands. Caroline complied, rising from the piano with relief. Her fingers ached from the repetition, and she was frustrated by her inability to execute the piece with the fluidity her instructor had demonstrated during the previous week's lesson. They ate in the dining room, Constance reviewing her notes for the meeting, while Caroline paged through a volume of Scott's poetry she had been assigned to read. The meal was brief, neither woman given to extended conversation during the midday hour. When they finished, Constance retired upstairs to collect her reticule and gloves, while Caroline returned to the piano, resigned to another hour of practice before her mother's departure would allow her a brief respite. At 1 o'clock, Constance departed for the church, walking briskly despite the heat that had settled over the city. The humidity from the river made the air feel thick, clinging, and by the time she reached Green Street, small beads of perspiration had formed along her hairline. The Methodist Church stood 3 blocks north of the commercial district, a white-painted building with tall windows that remained open during the warm months to admit whatever breeze might offer relief. Inside, the other members of the Ladies' Benevolent Society were already assembling, 15 women of varying ages, all from families of standing, all committed to the charitable work that defined their social position as much as their husband's professional success. Constance took her customary seat near the front and prepared her writing materials, ready to record the meeting's proceedings. At the Whitfield house, Caroline ceased her piano practice and moved to the window, grateful for the temporary quiet. Martha was in the kitchen, heating water for the afternoon laundry, a task that would occupy her for the next several hours. The house felt empty in the particular way it did when her mother was absent, and Caroline savored the solitude, the freedom from the constant low-level surveillance that characterized her days. She did not hear her father's approach until he was already at the front door, his key turning in the lock. She turned from the window, surprised by his early arrival, and met him in the entrance hall with an expression of mild inquiry. Augustus removed his hat and set down his portfolio, his movements deliberate, controlled. He explained that certain documents required her signature, family matters related to property arrangements that needed to be formalized that afternoon. His tone was matter-of-fact, betraying none of the chaos that roiled beneath the surface. Caroline accepted the explanation without question, as he knew she would, and asked whether she should change from her day dress. Augustus told her it would not be necessary. The matter would take only a few minutes. Martha appeared from the kitchen, acknowledging Augustus's presence with a brief nod before returning to her work. Augustus led Caroline into the front parlor and gestured for her to sit at the small writing desk near the window. He withdrew the indenture document from his portfolio and placed it on the desk, smoothing the creases with fingers that trembled slightly despite his efforts at composure. Caroline glanced at the document, noting the printed text and the spaces where signatures were required, but she did not read it closely. Augustus had trained her well in obedience, entrusting that he would handle all matters requiring judgment or legal understanding. She waited for his instruction, her hands folded in her lap, her expression attentive and compliant. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the witnesses. Augustus admitted them, first Brennan, then Dr. Garrett, each man entering with the professional detachment appropriate for routine business. Augustus made no introductions, offering only the minimal explanation that the gentlemen were present to witness signatures on a family document. He placed a pen in Caroline's hand and indicated the signature line at the bottom of the page. She signed her name in the careful script she had been taught, each letter formed with precision. Caroline Whitfield. She set down the pen and looked up at her father, waiting for whatever would come next. Augustus signed beside her name, his own signature larger, more assured. Brennan and Garrett added their marks as witnesses, both men completing the task with the swift efficiency of those accustomed to such procedures. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. The witnesses departed with brief farewells, and Caroline remained seated, uncertain whether she had fulfilled her obligation or whether something more was required of her. Augustus returned the document to his portfolio and informed Caroline that they needed to visit the bank to file the paperwork. She rose without protest, collected her bonnet from the hall stand, and followed her father into the afternoon heat. They walked in silence through streets that shimmered with humidity, past the shops and offices that comprised Augusta's commercial heart, until they reached the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company. Augustus held the door for his daughter, ushering her into the cool dimness of the lobby and up the stairs to his private office. Inside the office, a man Caroline did not recognize sat in one of the leather chairs near Augustus's desk. He rose when they entered, his gaze moving immediately to Caroline and remaining fixed there with an assessment that made her skin prickle with vague discomfort. Augustus made no introduction, instead closing the door and moving to his desk where he withdrew the indenture document and the letter of conveyance from his portfolio. He handed both papers to the stranger, who examined them with the careful attention of someone verifying a purchase. Caroline watched this exchange with growing confusion, her mind struggling to construct an explanation for what was happening. When the stranger folded the documents and placed them in his own leather case, Caroline turned to her father, her expression now openly uncertain, seeking the reassurance that had always been her right as his daughter. Augustus could not meet her eyes. He looked instead at the papers on his desk, at the window behind her, at anything but her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, drained of the warmth she had known all her life. He explained that the documents she had signed constituted an indenture contract, that she was now bound to 12 years of service in the household of Mr. Hiram Caldwell of Savannah, that this arrangement satisfied certain debts he had incurred and could not otherwise repay. Caroline's response began as disbelief, then shifted rapidly through confusion to dawning horror as the reality of what had been done to her settled into place. She looked to the stranger, Caldwell, who regarded her with the cool evaluation of a man assessing livestock. She turned back to her father, her voice rising, words tumbling out in a rush of panic and betrayal, pleading for explanation, for reversal, for mercy. But Augustus had prepared for this moment, had armored himself against it with layers of justification and necessity. He repeated the legal facts. The contract was signed, witnessed, and binding. Caroline was no longer under his authority. She belonged, in every sense that mattered under Georgia law, to Caldwell, who would determine her placement, her conditions of labor, and her future. Caldwell rose and moved toward Caroline, his hand reaching for her arm. She recoiled, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes wide with the animal terror of prey cornered. Augustus watched this scene from behind his desk, his hands gripping the polished wood edge hard enough that his knuckles whitened, and felt something fundamental break inside him, some last barrier between who he had been and what he had become. May 15th, 1852. Caldwell's grip on Caroline's arm was firm, practiced, the hand of a man who had conducted similar transactions before. She tried to pull away, but he held fast, his other hand reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a length of cord. Augustus saw the cord and understood its purpose, and the understanding made him speak for the first time since Caroline had begun pleading. He told Caldwell there was no need for restraints, that Caroline would comply. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. Caldwell ignored him, looping the cord around Caroline's wrists with efficient movements, tying a knot that would not slip but would not cut circulation. The cord was hemp, dyed dark, unremarkable except for the fact that it now bound Augustus's daughter like livestock being led to market. Caroline had stopped speaking. Her mouth remained open, her breath coming in short gasps, but no words emerged. She stared at her father with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something beyond betrayal, beyond horror, a kind of absolute incomprehension that erased every assumption she had ever held about the world and her place in it. Augustus looked away. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, and listened to the sounds of Caldwell preparing for departure, the rustle of papers being secured in a leather case, the creak of floorboards as Caldwell guided Caroline toward the door, the small, choked sound Caroline made when she stumbled slightly, and Caldwell steadied her with a hand that was neither rough nor gentle, merely utilitarian. Caldwell informed Augustus that he would be departing for Savannah within the hour, that the evening steamboat left the levee at 6 o'clock, that he had already secured passage for himself and his newly acquired property. He specified that the indenture contract would be registered with the Chatham County clerk upon his arrival in Savannah, creating a duplicate record that would prevent any attempt at reversal. His tone was businesslike, courteous even, as though he were discussing the transfer of farmland or commercial goods. Augustus nodded without turning from the window. He heard the door open, heard Caroline's footsteps pause as though she might make one final appeal, heard Caldwell's quiet instruction for her to move forward, heard the door close. The office was silent. Through the window, Augustus watched the late afternoon traffic on Broad Street. A wagon hauling lumber, two women in bonnets walking arm in arm, a Negro man leading a mule loaded with cotton sacks. The ordinary commerce of a prosperous city, indifferent to the transaction that had just concluded in the room behind him. The clock on his desk chimed the quarter hour, 4:45. Constance would still be at the Methodist Church, recording the minutes of the Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting. She would not return home until 5:30 at the earliest. Augustus had perhaps 45 minutes before he would need to be home, before Martha would begin to notice his absence and Caroline's prolonged errand. He remained at the window for 10 minutes, watching the street, his mind curiously blank. Then he collected his hat and portfolio, locked his office, and descended to the bank lobby where Preston Montgomery was closing out the day's accounts. Augustus informed Montgomery that he was unwell, that he would be leaving early, that Montgomery should close the bank at the usual hour. Montgomery expressed concern, but Augustus waved it away and departed into the heat of late afternoon. The walk home took 12 minutes. Augustus counted his steps, noting the cracks in the wooden walkway, the smell of cooking fires from the houses he passed, the way the light slanted through the live oak trees that lined Ellis Street. These details impressed themselves on his consciousness with unnatural clarity, as though his mind were documenting evidence for some future reckoning. Martha was in the kitchen when he entered, stirring something in a large pot on the stove. The smell was chicken stock, sharp and familiar. She looked up when Augustus appeared in the doorway, surprised by his early return. He informed her that he had sent Caroline on an errand to the bank, that she would be delayed, that Martha should proceed with dinner preparations without waiting. Martha accepted this explanation with a brief nod and returned to her stirring. Augustus retired to his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept a decanter of brandy and a single glass. He poured 2 fingers and drank it in one swallow, feeling the burn in his throat and stomach. He poured again, and this time sipped slowly, staring at the papers on his desk without seeing them. At the Savannah River levee, Caldwell guided Caroline up the gangplank of the steamboat Georgia, a side-wheeler that made the run between Augusta and Savannah 3 times weekly, carrying freight and passengers downriver to the port city. The boat was large, 200 feet in length, with a capacity for 70 passengers and substantial cargo. Smoke rose from its twin stacks, and the paddle wheels creaked as deckhands made final preparations for departure. Caldwell had purchased passage in the main cabin, a long room with wooden benches along the walls and a cast-iron stove in the center. Other passengers were already seated, merchants and planters returning to Savannah after conducting business in Augusta. A few women traveled with children, and one elderly man sat alone near the stove reading a newspaper. None of them paid particular attention to Caldwell and the young woman with bound wrists who entered behind him. Caldwell chose a bench near the rear of the cabin, positioned so he could observe the door. He directed Caroline to sit, and she complied mechanically, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. The cord around her wrists was visible beneath the sleeves of her dress, but Caldwell made no effort to conceal it. If any passenger noticed, they gave no indication, maintaining the careful indifference that characterized public spaces in the antebellum South when matters of property and servitude were concerned. The steamboat's whistle blew twice, a long mournful sound that carried across the water and up into the streets of Augusta. The paddle wheels began to turn, churning the brown water of the Savannah River into foam. The boat pulled away from the levee, swinging into the current that would carry it southeast toward the Atlantic coast and the city where Caroline's new life would begin. The journey would take 18 hours, with the boat traveling through the night and arriving in Savannah by noon the following day. Caldwell had made this trip dozens of times and knew its rhythms. The gradual transition from narrow river to wider channel, the increasing humidity as they descended toward the coast. the way dawn would break over the marshlands that marked the approach to the city. Caroline sat motionless throughout the first hour of the voyage. Her eyes remained open, but she appeared to see nothing. Other passengers came and went, stretching their legs on deck or taking meals in the adjacent dining cabin. Caldwell left her twice, once to speak with the captain about arrival logistics, once to procure bread and water which he placed on the bench beside her. She did not touch the food. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit throughout the cabin, casting pools of yellow light that swayed with the boat's motion. Most passengers settled into uncomfortable sleep, heads resting against the cabin wall or pillowed on bundles of clothing. Caldwell remained awake, his attention moving between Caroline and the darkened windows, through which nothing was visible except occasional lights from plantations along the riverbank. In Augusta, Constance returned home at 6 o'clock to find Augustus in his study and Martha in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. She inquired about Caroline, and Augustus repeated the explanation he had given Martha. Caroline had been detained by an errand to the bank, routine paperwork that required additional time. Constance accepted this with mild irritation. Caroline knew to be home before supper, but no particular alarm. They ate in the dining room, Augustus and Constance, with Martha serving cold ham and potatoes and greens. The conversation was minimal. Constance described the Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting, the ongoing debate about funding for the orphan asylum, the various proposals that had been discussed. Augustus offered appropriate responses, his voice steady, his expression neutral. By 7 o'clock, Constance's irritation had shifted to concern. She sent Martha to check Caroline's room, thinking perhaps Caroline had returned through the garden entrance and gone directly upstairs without announcing herself. Martha returned with the report that Caroline's room was empty, her bed unslept in, no sign of recent occupation. Constance turned to Augustus with an expression that demanded explanation. Augustus set down his fork and told her there had been a complication with certain family financial matters, that Caroline had been required to accompany a business associate to Savannah, that the departure had been sudden but necessary, that Caroline would be well cared for and would write soon. The words sounded implausible even as he spoke them. Constance stared at him with dawning suspicion, her face draining of color. She asked what business associate, what financial matters, why Caroline would travel to Savannah without her mother's knowledge or consent, why she would depart without a change of clothing or any preparation. Augustus had no adequate answers. He repeated the same vague phrases, business complications, necessary arrangements, temporary measures, until Constance rose from her chair, her voice rising with it, demanding the truth with an urgency that made Martha retreat to the kitchen and close the door. Augustus told her, not all of it, not the full magnitude of his debts or the months of calculation that had led to this moment, but the essential facts. He had incurred substantial obligations. He had no means to satisfy them. He had signed an indenture contract binding Caroline to 12 years of service. The contract had been executed that afternoon. Caroline was now the legal property of Hiram Caldwell of Savannah. Constance's response began as disbelief, identical to Caroline's initial reaction in the bank office. She demanded to see the contract, to speak with the authorities, to retrieve Caroline immediately. Augustus explained the legal realities. The contract was signed, witnessed, and registered. Caroline was beyond reach of reversal or appeal. Any attempt to interfere would result in criminal prosecution for theft of property. The phrase theft of property applied to her daughter broke something fundamental in Constance. She collapsed into her chair, her breathing rapid and shallow, her hands gripping the table edge hard enough that her knuckles whitened. She did not weep. She made no sound at all. She simply sat, staring at her husband with an expression of such profound revulsion that Augustus had to look away. The church bells rang 8 o'clock. The sound carried clearly through the open windows, the same bells that had marked every hour of Augustus's life in Augusta, now marking the hour when his wife fully comprehended what he had done. 3 blocks away at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the evening prayers concluded, and parishioners began their walks home through streets cooling slowly in the May darkness. On the steamboat Georgia, Caroline stirred for the first time in 3 hours. She turned her head to look at Caldwell, her expression no longer blank but sharpened by a kind of desperate calculation. She asked, in a voice hoarse from disuse, what would be required of her in Savannah, what household she would serve, what the conditions of her labor would entail. Caldwell regarded her with the mild interest of a buyer assessing newly purchased livestock. He explained that she would not be serving in his household, that he maintained no permanent residence in Savannah, that his business was conducted from a series of rented rooms and offices suited to a man who traveled frequently. He explained that her indenture would be sold within a week of their arrival, that there were several interested parties who valued educated servants capable of managing household accounts and instructing children, that she would likely be placed with a family of means who could afford the premium her particular skills commanded. Caroline absorbed this information in silence. Then she asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, whether there was any circumstance under which the indenture might be dissolved before the expiration of the 12-year term. Caldwell considered the question with apparent seriousness before responding that dissolution was theoretically possible through purchase, that if someone were willing to pay the value of the remaining term, the indenture could be transferred or retired, but that such transactions were rare and required substantial capital. He did not add what both of them understood, that Augustus Whitfield possessed no such capital, that the very fact of Caroline's indenture was proof of his financial ruin, that no one in her family's social circle would be willing or able to ransom her at a price Caldwell would find acceptable. Caroline turned away and resumed staring at nothing. Caldwell settled back against the cabin wall and closed his eyes, his hand resting lightly on the leather case that contained the indenture contract and the letter of conveyance. Documents that had transformed a banker's daughter into a commodity, valued at $4,327. The steamboat continued its journey through the darkness, passing rice plantations and timber stands and small settlements, where lights flickered briefly before being swallowed by the night. The Savannah River widened gradually as the boat descended toward the coast, the current carrying them forward with steady inevitability toward the city, where Caroline Whitfield would cease to exist in some new identity. Some redefined version of herself stripped of family and future would take her place. In Augusta, Constance remained at the dining table until midnight, saying nothing, asking nothing more, simply sitting in the presence of the man she had married 16 years earlier and whom she now recognized as a stranger capable of acts she had never imagined possible. Augustus remained with her, unable to offer comfort or justification, watching the candles burn down and the shadows lengthen until Martha finally appeared to ask whether anything more was needed and was sent away with instructions to retire. When the clock chimed 1 in the morning, Constance rose and walked upstairs without looking at Augustus. He heard her door close and the lock turn with a click that seemed to echo through the house. He remained alone in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the interrupted meal, and understood that something had ended that could never be restored, that the transaction he had executed to preserve his position had instead destroyed everything that position was meant to protect. The church bells did not ring at 1 o'clock. The city slept, unaware that one of its daughters had been sold into servitude by the father entrusted with her care, unaware that the ledgers and contracts that governed its commerce could be applied with equal efficiency to human beings as to property, unaware that the institutions designed to maintain order and prosperity could be perverted to serve the desperate calculations of men who had lost everything except the power to sacrifice those who trusted them most. May 16th, November 1852. The steamboat Georgia arrived at Savannah's waterfront at 11:30 the following morning. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and the air carried the distinctive smell of the coastal city. Salt marsh, tar, cotton warehouses, and the human density of a port where 20,000 souls conducted the business of commerce with the efficiency of an organism devoted entirely to profit. Caldwell disembarked with Caroline, guiding her down the gangplank with the same utilitarian grip he had maintained throughout the journey. Her wrists remained bound, though he had repositioned the cord beneath her sleeves during the final hour of travel, a concession to appearances rather than comfort. On the crowded wharf, surrounded by stevedores and merchants and travelers, the cord was invisible, and Caroline appeared to be merely another young woman arriving in Savannah under the care of a male relative or employer. They walked 2 blocks inland to a brick building on Bryan Street, where Caldwell maintained rooms that served as both residence and office. The building housed a variety of commercial tenants, a cotton factor, an insurance agent, a lawyer whose practice specialized in estate settlements, and Caldwell's quarters occupied the 3rd floor, consisting of 2 rooms furnished with the spare functionality of a man who traveled frequently and maintained no permanent domestic establishment. He secured Caroline in the smaller of the 2 rooms, locking the door from the outside and leaving her with a basin of water and a chamber pot. Through the window, which faced an interior courtyard rather than the street, she could see the backs of other buildings, laundry hanging on lines strung between windows, and a fragment of sky that showed no indication of the world beyond this confined space. Caldwell departed immediately for the Chatham County Courthouse on Wright Square, where he presented the indenture contract to the clerk's office for registration. The process was routine, requiring less than 15 minutes. The clerk examined the document, verified the signatures and witness marks, recorded the essential information in the county's ledger of indentures, and affixed the official seal that made the contract part of the public record. The entry was brief. Caroline Whitfield, white female, age 16, indentured for 12 years to Hiram Caldwell, consideration $4,327, registered May 16, 1852. The clerk asked no questions. Indenture registrations were common enough, though most involved freedmen or poor whites entering labor contracts with planters or manufacturers. The involvement of a young woman from what appeared to be a respectable family was unusual but not unprecedented, and the clerk's function was administrative rather than investigative. He returned the original document to Caldwell, retained a copy for the courthouse files, and wished him good day. Caldwell's next stop was an office on Factor's Walk, where a commission broker named Josiah Mercer conducted a business that dealt in various forms of property, including real estate, commercial goods, and the buying and selling of labor contracts. Mercer was a prosperous man in his 40s, well-connected among Savannah's merchant class, who maintained relationships with households seeking domestic servants of particular qualifications. Caldwell explained what he had available: a 16-year-old white woman, educated, literate, capable of household accounting and music instruction, indentured for 12 years with no encumbrances or legal complications. Mercer inquired about the circumstances of the indenture, and Caldwell provided the explanation he had rehearsed: family insolvency, voluntary contract to satisfy debts, entirely legal and properly documented. Mercer accepted this account without skepticism. Such arrangements, while uncommon for white women of good family, were within the boundaries of acceptable commercial practice when financial necessity demanded it. Mercer had 3 potential buyers in mind. The first was a rice planter named Habersham, who maintained a townhouse in Savannah and sought a governess for his young daughters. The second was a physician's widow who required assistance managing a household and overseeing her late husband's remaining business affairs. The third was a merchant named Stiles, who had recently relocated from Charleston and needed educated domestic help to establish his household, according to Charleston's particular standards of refinement. Caldwell authorized Mercer to arrange viewings with all 3 parties, specifying a minimum price of $4,000, slightly less than the debt Caroline's indenture had satisfied, but acceptable given the transaction costs and the need for quick sale. Mercer agreed to present the opportunity to his clients and schedule appointments for the following day. In Augusta, Constance Whitfield had not slept. She remained in her locked bedroom throughout the night and into the following morning, refusing food when Martha brought it, refusing to speak when Augustus knocked on the door and attempted to explain, refusing to acknowledge anything except the single fact that her daughter had been sold into servitude and was beyond her reach. By mid-morning, Martha's concern had overcome her trained discretion. She appeared at Augustus's study door and informed him that Mrs. Whitfield was unwell, that a physician should be summoned, that the household could not function normally under these circumstances. Augustus sent Martha away with vague assurances that the matter would resolve itself, that Mrs. Whitfield merely required time, that no physician was necessary. But Martha was not satisfied. She had worked in the Whitfield household for 7 years, had observed Caroline grow from a child of 9 into a young woman of 16, had understood the rhythms and relationships that structured the family's life. Caroline's sudden absence, Mrs. Whitfield's distress, and Mr. Whitfield's evasive explanations combined to create a narrative that Martha could not fully comprehend, but recognized as fundamentally wrong. She did what any servant in her position would do under such circumstances. She spoke to other servants in neighboring households, and through the invisible network of domestic workers who observed everything that happened in Augusta's respectable homes, the story began to circulate in fragmentary, distorted form. Caroline Whitfield had disappeared. Her mother was distraught. Her father would offer no explanation. Something terrible had occurred, though the precise nature of the terrible thing remained unclear. By afternoon of the 16th, 3 women from the Ladies' Benevolent Society called at the Whitfield house to inquire about Constance, who had left the previous day's meeting abruptly and failed to return. Augustus received them in the front parlor and explained that Constance was indisposed, that she would require some days of rest, that their concern was appreciated but unnecessary. The women accepted this explanation with polite skepticism and departed, but their own observations, Constance's distress, Augustus's strained manner, Caroline's absence, added to the accumulating sense that something was amiss. At the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company, Preston Montgomery noticed irregularities in Augustus's behavior that had been developing over recent months, but had intensified since the previous afternoon. Augustus was distracted, made small errors in calculations, failed to respond when spoken to, and displayed none of his customary precision in handling the bank's business. Montgomery said nothing, but he observed, and his observations would matter later when events unfolded in ways no one yet anticipated. In Savannah, Caroline spent 16 hours alone in the locked room, sitting on the narrow bed that constituted the room's primary furniture, staring at the wall with an expression that had progressed beyond shock into a kind of protective numbness. She did not weep. She did not pace. She simply sat, her mind attempting and failing to construct a framework that could accommodate what had been done to her. The following day, May 17th, Josiah Mercer arrived at Caldwell's rooms with the rice planter Habersham, who had expressed strong interest in acquiring Caroline's indenture for service as governess to his daughters. Habersham was a man of 60, prosperous, conventional, who examined Caroline with the same careful attention he would apply to purchasing a horse or inspecting a shipment of goods. He inquired about her education, her musical training, her facility with French and arithmetic. Caroline answered his questions in a voice devoid of inflection, providing the information he required with mechanical accuracy. Habersham seemed satisfied. He discussed terms with Caldwell and Mercer, agreed to a price of $4,200, and indicated his intention to complete the transaction within 2 days, pending verification of the indenture's legal standing. Mercer arranged for a lawyer to review the contract, a routine precaution for transactions of this value. The lawyer examined the document, confirmed that it met all legal requirements for indentures executed in Georgia, verified the registration with the Chatham County Clerk, and provided his opinion that the contract was valid and enforceable. On May 19th, Habersham delivered payment in the form of a bank draft, and the indenture was transferred from Caldwell to Habersham by formal bill of sale, which was itself registered with the county clerk. Caroline Whitfield, who had been her father's daughter 4 days earlier, was now the legal property of a rice planter who would transport her to his holdings 30 miles south of Savannah, where she would spend her days instructing his 3 daughters in deportment, literature, and music, and her nights sleeping in a small room adjacent to the children's quarters, available at any hour should her services be required. In Augusta, The fragmented rumors about Caroline's disappearance had begun to coalesce into something approaching coherent narrative, though the truth remained obscured by the social conventions that prevented direct inquiry into another family's private affairs. It was known that Caroline was gone, that Constance was devastated, that Augustus offered no satisfactory explanation. It was suspected that financial difficulties were involved, though the specific nature of those difficulties remained unclear. On May 21st, a woman named Margaret Thornton, who had served as Caroline's music instructor for 3 years, called at the Whitfield house and demanded to see her pupil. Augustus informed Mrs. Thornton that Caroline was no longer in residence, that she had entered into service in another city, that her studies would necessarily be discontinued. Mrs. Thornton, who was not a woman easily dismissed, insisted on knowing the circumstances, and Augustus, exhausted by days of evasion, told her. Mrs. Thornton's response was immediate and public. She returned to her own home and composed a letter that she sent to 12 of her acquaintances, describing what Augustus had revealed: that Caroline Whitfield had been indentured for 12 years to satisfy her father's debts, that she had been sold to a party in Savannah, that she was now beyond reach of family or friends. Mrs. Thornton's letter concluded with language that left no ambiguity about her assessment. Augustus Whitfield had betrayed every duty a father owed his child, had violated every principle of Christian morality, and deserved the condemnation of all decent persons. The scandal broke across Augusta's social landscape with devastating speed. Within 3 days, Augustus Whitfield's position in the community had collapsed entirely. Families who had dined at his table ceased all association. The Ladies' Benevolent Society sent representatives to offer constant support, while making clear that Augustus was no longer welcome in their church. Business associates who had worked with him for years began to distance themselves, concerned that association with a man who had sold his daughter might taint their own reputations. On May 27th, the board of directors of the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company held an emergency meeting to address the situation. Augustus was summoned and questioned about his financial affairs. The investigation revealed what Augustus had concealed for 18 months: the land speculation, the loans from Savannah creditors, the accumulation of debt that had no possibility of repayment from legitimate sources. The board voted unanimously to terminate his employment, effective immediately, for conduct unbecoming a banking officer and for unauthorized use of his position to facilitate personal transactions. The loss of his position destroyed the last foundation of Augustus's carefully constructed life. Without employment, he had no income. Without income, he could not maintain the house on Ellis Street. Without social standing, he had no prospects for future employment in any capacity that would preserve even the appearance of respectability. Constance left him. She returned to Charleston to live with her sister's family, refusing to speak with Augustus before her departure, leaving behind a household that had already begun to disintegrate. Martha gave notice and secured a position with another family. The house was sold at auction to satisfy creditors. Augustus moved to a boarding house on the outskirts of Augusta, where he occupied a single room and took irregular work as a clerk for a cotton factor, employment that paid barely enough to cover his rent and meals. In late June, Constance engaged a Charleston lawyer to investigate the possibility of reversing Caroline's indenture. The lawyer reviewed the documents, consulted with legal authorities in both Georgia and South Carolina, and delivered his opinion. The contract was legally sound, properly executed, and beyond challenge. Caroline's signature, witnessed and registered, constituted her consent regardless of whether she had understood what she was signing. The transfer of the indenture from Caldwell to Habersham was similarly valid. Caroline was bound for 12 years, and no legal mechanism existed to free her except purchase of the remaining term at a price Habersham would set, and which, the lawyer estimated, would exceed $6,000 given the value Habersham placed on Caroline's particular qualifications. Constance had no access to such funds. Her own family provided subsistence, but could not or would not raise the capital necessary to ransom Caroline. Constance wrote to Habersham directly, appealing to his conscience, offering to compensate him over time, through whatever means she could arrange. Habersham responded with courtesy but finality. He had purchased Caroline's indenture in good faith through legal process. He had already invested in her transportation and establishment in his household, and he had no inclination to reverse a transaction that met his needs and complied with all applicable laws. Constance's final act was to write to Caroline, a letter delivered through Habersham's business agent in Savannah, with no guarantee it would reach her daughter. The letter expressed love, sorrow, helplessness, and a hope that Caroline would somehow survive the next 12 years and return to a family that would receive her without shame. Whether Caroline received this letter was never confirmed. Habersham's household maintained no correspondence records for indentured servants, and no reply ever arrived in Charleston. Through the summer and into autumn of 1852, the scandal gradually faded from Augusta's active attention, displaced by other events and newer outrages. Augustus Whitfield became a figure of contempt, occasionally seen walking to his work at the cotton factor's office, avoiding eye contact, speaking to no one. Constance remained in Charleston, living in circumstances of genteel poverty, sustained by family charity and what work she could secure as a seamstress. Caroline disappeared into the vast apparatus of servitude that structured the antebellum South, one young woman among tens of thousands whose labor sustained the households and prosperity of the planter class. In October, a brief notice appeared in the Augusta Chronicle recording the dissolution of the Whitfield household, the sale of property to satisfy debts, and the departure of Mrs. Whitfield to reside with family in South Carolina. The notice made no mention of Caroline. The public record contained only the facts deemed necessary for commercial and legal purposes. Augustus Whitfield, formerly cashier of the Augusta Insurance and Banking Company, had resigned his position, satisfied certain debts through liquidation of assets, and ceased to maintain his previous residence. These facts, recorded in the newspaper and in courthouse documents, constituted the official narrative. The true narrative, that a banker had sold his daughter to save himself from ruin, that a young woman had been converted into property through contracts signed in her father's office, that institutions designed to preserve order had facilitated this transaction with bureaucratic efficiency, remained largely invisible except to those directly involved and to the network of servants and secondary observers who understood but could not challenge what had occurred. In November 1852, 7 months after Caroline's indenture, Augustus Whitfield was found dead in his boarding house room. The physician who examined the body determined the cause as heart failure, though neighbors reported that Augustus had been drinking heavily in recent weeks and had expressed in his rare moments of conversation a wish that he had died before making the choices that had destroyed his family. The death was recorded without ceremony. Augustus was buried in an unmarked grave in the city cemetery, attended by no mourners, his passing noted in the newspaper with a single line: Augustus Whitfield, aged 49, formerly of this city. Constance learned of her husband's death 3 weeks later through a letter from the boarding house proprietor, who inquired whether she wished to claim his few remaining possessions. She declined. The possessions, a trunk containing some clothing, a few books, and a locked box with papers including the original copy of Caroline's indenture contract, were sold to settle Augustus's final debts. Caroline Whitfield served her 12-year term in the Habersham household, teaching the planter's daughters, managing certain household accounts, and performing the various duties required of an educated domestic servant. Records from the period provide no details of her daily life, her treatment, or her emotional state. The 1860 census for Chatham County lists her among the Habersham household members as a white female, age 24, occupation governess, born in Georgia. The census provides no indication that she was indentured rather than free, no notation of the contract that bound her, no suggestion of the circumstances that had brought her to this position. In 1864, with the Confederacy collapsing and the social order of the antebellum South disintegrating, Caroline's indenture became effectively unenforceable. Habersham's plantation was seized by federal forces in January 1865, and the household scattered. Caroline, then 28 years old and technically still bound for 4 more months until the May expiration of her 12-year term, simply walked away. She was recorded in no further documents, appeared in no subsequent census records under her own name, and left no trace in the historical record beyond the indenture contract registered in 1852 and the single census entry from 1860. Whether she survived the war, where she went, what name she might have taken, whether she ever contacted her mother in Charleston, all of this remains unknown. Caroline Whitfield ceased to exist as a documentary presence in May 1865, absorbed into the chaos of a collapsing society where contracts and property records and the entire apparatus of legal servitude lost their meaning and their power to bind. In the decades following the war, when Augusta rebuilt itself as a commercial center and Savannah recovered its position as a major port, the story of Augustus Whitfield and his daughter became one of many cautionary tales exchanged in quiet conversations but never formally recorded. Old residents remembered the scandal, though details blurred and shifted over time. Some versions held that Caroline had died in servitude. Others claimed she had escaped to the north. Still others insisted she had married after her release and lived under a different name, deliberately erasing her connection to the events of 1852. In 1889, when Chatham County transferred old indenture records to new filing systems, Caroline's contract was preserved among thousands of similar documents, a single piece of paper recording a transaction that had once meant everything to the people it touched, but now existed only as data in an archive that few would ever consult. The contract itself, 2 pages, carefully written, properly witnessed, officially sealed, offered no indication of the human cost it represented. It was simply another legal instrument, no different in form from the property deeds and bills of sale that surrounded it in the courthouse files. The house on Ellis Street, where Caroline had practiced her piano lessons, was sold in 1853, occupied by a series of families over subsequent decades, eventually demolished in 1901 to make room for commercial development. The Augusta Insurance and Banking Company continued operations until 1869, when it failed during the financial disruptions of Reconstruction. The building that had housed it was converted to other uses. No marker or memorial indicated that this was where a father had sold his daughter, where contracts had been signed that transformed a human being into property, valued at $4,327. By the early 20th century, when Augusta had grown into a small city and Savannah had established itself as a center of historical preservation, the story of Caroline Whitfield had faded entirely from public memory. The scandal that had consumed Augusta's attention for months in 1852 left no lasting mark on the city's historical narrative. The Whitfield name disappeared from local records after Augustus's death and Constance's departure. Caroline herself, whether alive or dead, remained forever 16 years old in the historical record, frozen at the moment when she signed her name to a document whose contents she had not understood, transforming her into the solution to her father's failures and the casualty of a system that measured human worth in dollars and bound human futures with contracts enforced by law. The only permanent record was the indenture itself, filed in the Chatham County Courthouse, surviving fires and floods and wars and the gradual decay of paper and ink, a document that would outlast everyone it touched and that contained in its careful script and official seals the entire brutal logic of a world where love and duty could be erased by debt, where fathers could sell daughters, where institutions designed to preserve order could facilitate absolute betrayal, and where the law itself, precise, procedural, indifferent, would enforce these transactions with the same mechanical efficiency it applied to the sale of livestock or land.